Slowly trickling in. Welcome. It's Webinar Wednesday, which is a good day. Means we get to join educators, share some information, engage in some discussion around who is qualified to lead Tier 3 work in your schools. It's a good question to answer and resolve, because answering this question means we're working towards increasing student access to important supports. If you can, drop your name, where you're coming from in the chat. We'd love to know that. I'm coming from Minneapolis, Minnesota, a great state of Minnesota. We have Kristen from Wyoming. I'm joined today by Nicole, our Tier 2 and Tier 3 specialist. Where are you coming from, Nicole?
I am here in Iowa, in like the central Iowa, Des Moines area. And it's
Ooh,
beautiful here actually for March. A lot of people are on spring break actually in Iowa. So if anyone is here from Iowa, it is probably your spring break right now.
it is a common week for spring break. Yadkinville, North Carolina. I've never heard of that. Definitely heard of Chapel Hill. Been there as a professor, had colleagues I did work with at UNC there. What a great place. Well, thank you all for joining us. We're going to go ahead and get started, make good use of this time today to go over an important topic, and that is thinking about Tier 3 through the lens of who is qualified to do this work. And hopefully we increase some clarity on who can take up the torch of Tier 3. If we get more educational professionals and collaborate with people outside of the school to come into school to deliver high quality supports, ultimately students are the winners, because that means more students access what they need. And so we have to be strategic about this. We got to really think about the people who are on our payroll, who are fingerprinted, as well as the strategic partnerships we cultivate. My name is Clay Cook. I'm the Chief Development Officer at Character Strong. I get to work with a bunch of purpose-driven people to try to make a difference in the world by equipping educators with low-burden, high-impact tools. And Nicole is going to be my partner today, and we are going to be going back and forth as we tackle this topic of, am I qualified to lead Tier 3? So I'm going to get us into this. In the chat, we'd love to hear from you. And this is just a relational activity, something, there's different perspectives on this one, but we'd love to hear from you. What is something students do today that is hard to understand why they do that? And I'm going to just hand it over to you first, Nicole. What is
Yeah.
something you see students today? And it's kind of, you're getting old when you look at what students are doing and you
Yes.
can't quite understand. What is
Yeah.
something, what comes to mind?
Something that students do today that I do not understand is watching other people play games. So like they'll go on YouTube and like watch another person play a video game, or another favorite of mine is watching like students watch unboxing videos. So students will go on YouTube or on TikTok, if they're on TikTok, and they like watch people unbox things that they've ordered. And so I think those two things are just very interesting, and why why are they engaging in this, but fun to watch.
Yeah, I'm looking in the chat, some of the TikTok
TikTok.
dances.
Oh, yes.
uh, you know, I have two daughters, and it is skincare routines, like multiple step skincare routines that are just out of hand. And I see my daughters rubbing things on their face or doing things that they have no clue what they're doing. I just can't, like, somehow they got sucked into it. And it's
Yep, they have like 12-step serum, moisturizer, eye cream routines,
oh,
and then
they've ended up with rashes on their face because of the chemicals. And I just cannot quite wrap my head around that. Um, it's just like something that I hopefully will be able to embrace at some point, to have empathy for my daughters. But at this point, I'm just like, what are you buying and what are you slathering onto your face?
And it's
So
expensive.
before we begin, just want to some of the logistics here. This is going to be recorded. People are on listen mode. We have links and resources that we're going to share with you out all throughout the chat. And yeah, use the chat or Q&A feature to engage today. If you have any questions that come up along this, feel free to use the chat or that Q&A feature, and we'll field those questions as best as possible and try to protect some time at the end to be able to do that. Now, I want to go over some of the objectives. One of the objectives is what happens in schools when too few people take up the torch of Tier 3. And so we got to really understand the implications of this, because if students have access gaps, what does that mean for students who need Tier 3 supports? What are the implications for them, for the school? And I like to consider broader society. Understanding who's qualified through the lens of what we're going to call scope of practice and scope of competence. And we'll define what those mean, but who is qualified really depends on who it's within their scope of practice. And then it could be within their scope of practice, but not yet within their scope of competence. And we got to grapple with those two ideas to expand the Tier 3 workforce. And then we're going to talk about how do we actually intentionally expand the workforce to deliver Tier 3 supports, so more students are able to access what they need to be successful in school. Now, after the webinar, we'll be sending out the slides in PDF format. We'll send the recording, and hopefully share some resources that allow you to get what you need. Here's a quote that really stands out to me. Frank Gresham's a prevention scientist, school psychologist, was a professor at Louisiana State University. And he said this: Tier 3 is some of the most significant work that can happen in our schools. That being said, when Tier 3 is weak, the student is likely on a trajectory towards negative life course outcomes, and society picks up the costs of that. So you think a lot about if we're not intentionally doing Tier 3 work well and enabling students to access what they need, some other system later on may end up catching this student, and it's maybe more costly and detrimental to themselves and society, because we're talking about students who have the greatest needs of supports. And so we're constantly grappling with this. How do we expand our workforce to make sure students can access what they need? And I'm going to hand it over to Nicole.
Yeah, so here at Character Strong, this is our what we call the formula for Tier 3. If you're familiar, there's also a formula for Tier 2 if you are participating in any of the Tier 2 solutions. So this is the formula for Tier 3, including the who, the what, and the how. So who are the students that would benefit from Tier 3 support? So this is few students who generally have an increase in behavior or mental health needs and concerns, right? So few students, right? We're not tackling a large group here. This is those students with really more specified needs. The what is those intensive personalized support. So these are going to be those supports that promote their success at school within our environments, or that environment that we have control over. And then this is a team-driven problem-solving process. We'll talk through this a little bit later. What is that problem-solving process? So this is how the team comes together to wrap support around our students. And this is going to include the student and their family. We want to also make sure that they are part of our team as well. So sort of what are Tier 3 supports? We want to define those. So this is personalizing supports for those few students, again, who would benefit from more intense supports. Tier 3 is not Tier 2 and it's not Tier 1, right? It is a separate tier for a reason. However, it's a layer of support on top of those Tier 1 and Tier 2 supports that we're already providing to students. So this is an intensification, meaning we're increasing the dosage of something, right? Maybe that's more instruction or more environmental support. And we have maybe an increase in intervention components. Traditionally, Tier 3 interventions tend to require a deeper knowledge through training and support. We're also going to talk through this today about what does that mean, that it requires deeper knowledge through training and support, and how can we get people access to that training and support so that we can increase our workforce. And also within Tier 3, our interventions are matched to some hypothesized root cause. So there's a process through which we find out what that root cause might be for the student's needs, and we match them to a precise intervention to meet those needs. And there are evidence-based supports. Clay is going to walk us through what some of those are for Tier 3.
So one paradigm to just think through, and this is the theory that rules all theories, and that is everything boils down to the person and their environment. And this is helpful to understand. It's like, what is the person accessing from the environment? What are the environmental supports in place that cultivate certain behaviors that result in success for that individual and others? And then there's the person, what the person brings to that environment. And sometimes the person needs the support to be able to acquire skills, knowledge, have different mindsets in order to meet challenges and demands for the environment. And so from this lens, there's two different kind of entry points in the type of supports that we can mobilize and make available at tier 3. Some of them are going to be environmental supports, really driven by what we call functional behavioral assessment to put in place teaching strategies, prevention strategies, and responsive practices. And some of them are more skill supports that are designed to teach students different skills to be able to regulate self and overcome challenges and demands from the environment. There are a range of evidence-based supports, and we have a document we're going to share with you here on what are some of the evidence-based tier 3 supports that schools have control over to be able to get up and going and enable students and families for that matter to access. So a couple I just want to point out that there's plenty of evidence supporting function-based behavior support plans when done in the right way through kind of a trauma-informed lens and a lens through which we're working with the student and the family to get certain supports in place. Highly effective, largely for students who have more challenging, intense externalizing behaviors. There's also cognitive behavioral interventions that involve psychoeducation about what a particular need is and the explicit teaching of what we call cognitive, emotion, and behavioral regulation skills that the student learns and develops fluency with to be able to overcome challenging situations. That's largely for students who have more internalizing types of emotions, anxiety, depression, trauma, and other emotion regulation challenges. Plenty of evidence. Educators have control over delivering these types of cognitive behavioral interventions. Now, for students who have executive functioning needs and really could benefit from tier 3 supports, there's evidence supporting more behavior supports that are embedded in the environment, as well as helping the student learn self-management tools like self-monitoring tools, timers, checklists that support them to improve their executive function and self-management to perform more consistently when under academic demands. The last bucket that you don't see here on the slide here is really family-focused supports, working with families in partnership to acquire knowledge and skills, to create more stable environments, to be able to put in place essentially effective parenting caregiver strategies, such as teaching and reinforcing desired behavior or effectively responding and holding the child accountable for undesired or unskillful behaviors, and to be able to create that consistency in the home context. All of those represent different types of interventions educators can get up and running. The question that we're tackling today is like, who does that work? So why do we need tier 3 in our schools is a good question to first ask, because we got to find the source of motivation to really invest in the energy and effort to expand our capacity when it comes to tier 3.
Yeah, and so what is our sort of rationale for why we need to provide these supports, those evidence-based interventions that Clay mentioned? Why do we need to do this in our school setting? Most of you here, I'm sure, have seen this, know this, have heard this before, right? That 1 out of 3 students struggles with mental health challenges and difficulties that impair some aspect of their functioning, right? Their day-to-day living, their ability to live their life, to come to school, to do what they need to do outside of school, right? We know that 1 in 3 students. We also know that 1 in 7 struggle with more intense mental health difficulties, and that is where it really significantly impairs their daily functioning. And we know that this pre-COVID was like 1 in 5 students. It has now changed to 1 in 3 and now 1 in 7 with that significant need. So we know that there are more students who are at risk for some of those negative life outcomes, as Clay mentioned, like with our quote earlier, that they're on that trajectory to those negative life outcomes. So it's really imperative for us in schools to think about how can we help students access and receive those supports. We know that The majority of young people who do have these difficulties will actually not receive quality mental health services. If they're not receiving it in schools, we tend to see that they do not receive it outside of school either. There is also research which suggests that there is sort of that gap in access to supports outside of school. So when students become adults, they can be waiting up to 10 years to receive high quality mental health support. So if we can start early in schools, it's really imperative. We won't go through all of these statistics on this slide, but we have seen an increase in high intensity behaviors. If you're an educator here, you know that, right? That behaviors have increased, and especially since COVID, they're not going down. And we also know that educators are really struggling with students with high intense behaviors. We know that that is leading to destructive behaviors in classrooms, unsafe learning environments for other students and educators. And so, again, part of our rationale is to help educators feel equipped to meet the needs of these students that are really impacting our schools. We know, so kind of the catch-all of this slide is that schools are the primary setting where students can receive care. And it is usually more impactful than some of our outside settings as well. So when we look at research and studies, when we see a clinic-based intervention, only about 12% of those young people who received a clinic-based intervention actually completed the intervention, right, in its entirety, meaning they got all of the things that they needed. They only completed about 12%. In a school-based setting, doing a very similar treatment, 93% completed the intervention. That is a huge difference in the completion of an intervention, right? So getting all of the things necessary and needed as part of that student's intervention, 93% completed it in school. Every time I see this, every time I hear this, as much as I present on it, it shocks me every single time. And I think it really speaks to the need that we have in our school environment to support these students. So what happens when students who need tier 3 are not able to access the support that they need? So go ahead and you can respond in the chat. What happens when students are not able to access that support? I can speak for myself as a school psychologist by training. It increases the referrals that come to me for evaluation for special education. So when students are unable to receive that support that they need, I see more referrals for evaluation as a school psychologist.
I like a couple of the answers here, Nicole. One from Natasha, thinking about the broader school environment, that because the student's need goes unaddressed, that student's functioning could be impacting others too. Not only self, we care about the individual student, but we also have the lens of others and the learning environment, and those behaviors could be impacting the broader learning environment as well. So there's like, yes, the need will potentially worsen, and the student, I like to think about all students on a trajectory. They're on a trajectory that maybe towards negative life course outcomes that we're not disrupting. And that because of that, there's also other ripple effects, which means it's impacting the broader classroom or school environment.
Yeah, absolutely. Our school community can be impacted by some of these students, which also in turn makes it really hard for that student to feel a part of the school community. And I saw another one in the chat that students may be removed from the classroom. Absolutely. We start to remove those students from their access, right? We start to restrict their environment. We place them in a more restrictive setting where they lose access to some of that maybe core instruction, they lose access to peers, they lose access to socialization. So absolutely.
Really good reflections. We have a problem to solve. This may not be a problem in your setting, but a lot of schools have kind of this problem. We think about a problem as a discrepancy or gap between what we expect to be happening and want to happen and what is actually happening. So the gap here is we know that there are students who need tier 3, but many of those students who need tier 3 aren't necessarily accessing quality tier 3 supports. And so we got to figure out, how do we solve this problem? How do we decrease it? Where if a student has a need for tier 3, they can get and access a quality tier 3 support that's likely to be beneficial to themselves and others in the school context. And that's the problem we're seeking to solve when we're thinking about workforce issues, and not only the workforce issue, the quality of care that the workforce is delivering. Because there's plenty of situations where kids are accessing things, but those things aren't necessarily beneficial and going to change the outcomes we want to improve. A couple of numbers we always say you need to know is base rate and capacity. We do have a dilemma too at the level of, oftentimes it feels and looks like there's way more students who need tier 3 than we have the capacity to meet the needs and properly deliver tier 3 supports for. So imagine you have a scenario where you have data, or it feels like 11% of students who look like they need tier 3, but in reality, your school's capacity based on your people, the time and resources available is we only can serve 4% of our students. And so we got to figure out what's going on here. And a lot of the time, we can never, discount the need for really quality prevention and early intervention prior to tier 3. So this is, we call it the dirty pond metaphor. Imagine tier 1 being a dirty pond. You take a kid off and you go to clean them off. That's the hose, the intervention, but the student ultimately has to return back into that kind of tier 1 context. It is very true that when tier 1 and tier 2 are weak, it looks like more students need tier 3. Tier 1 as a foundation of prevention is so essential because tier 1 serves multiple purposes. It's not only to prevent difficulties from ever occurring in the first place, it's also for students, if you don't even have a need or a difficulty, it can accelerate and enhance and promote performance. This last piece here, enable, tier 1, when it's in place, also enables more intensive supports to work more effectively. So those foundational supports, because tier 3 is in addition to tier 1. Oftentimes we're expecting too much out of our interventions when tier 1 is not intact, because to the extent tier 1's not in place, the kid doesn't feel like they belong, or the classroom context doesn't have good predictability and structure and routines, nor clear expectations, nor teaching all students how to kind of navigate school and stay regulated or build healthy relationships. That's foundational support. To the extent there's gaps there, more kids are going to look like they have a need for intensive support. So this idea of making sure we have the base rate and the capacity rate are aligned is essential with really quality tier 1 and tier 2 work. Now, tier 2 is all about early intervention, and early intervention means students are accessing a support as close to the time when a need emerges. And we expect, often in schools, we expect tier 3 supports, which are too time intensive, when the student has a lesser need, would respond to something that isn't as intense, doesn't require as much time, nor does require as sophisticated training and background experience to be able to do it. One of the pieces we want to talk about here is really this idea of pre-implementation. I'm going to turn it over to Nicole to think through the lens of how do we get things ready to go when we're doing tier 3 work.
Yeah, so as we add other layers of support, as we add another tier to our system, we have to do some of that work to get our team and our whole system ready. So part of that is going to be this idea of pre-implementation, right? So this is going to be kind of that work that we do ahead of time to make sure that our school system is ready and that we have the investment to do this work. That is a really big piece. We want to make sure that our people are invested in providing this level of support to students. We also then, right, so we have our kind of seed planting, right, as our pre-implementation. We have to water those seeds, right? So what does actual active implementation look like in order to lead to continuous improvement, right? This is all of those practices that will lead us to high fidelity, making sure that we can sustain our practices, because we don't want to start something that we're not going to continuously sustain, right? So we have to do not only this pre-implementation work, but then there's active and ongoing implementation of practices to make sure that we can sustain this for those students that really need these tier 3 levels of support.
And we dropped in a pre-implementation checklist for tier 3. Part of it is getting the people ready. And part of getting people ready is role clarity. Who's going to do this work? And ultimately, it's the work of a team, getting a team ready, identifying who's responsible for what, and figuring out how many students can certain individuals in our school system that are on our payroll, how many can they serve? And so we start to do some kind of initially fuzzy math and turn it into more precise math to determine our capacity. And so pre-implementation work, that whole school readiness, we have shared understanding of who needs tier 3. We have shared understanding of what the tier 3 supports are, but also that shared clarity around the roles of our people and who's going to be a part of the team and who's going to be delivering these tier 3 supports. And that work is really essential to ultimately make sure we're all getting in the same boat. There's certain outcomes we want to achieve for our students with the greatest need for support. And if we meet these students' needs, we're doing some of the most important work in our schools because we're altering life course trajectories of young people. But we got to be out in the boat, rowing in the same direction. We're really clear on the types of practices we're going to put in place that students need from us. And we're going to use those to take collective action to wrap support around students. And so we know we need pre-implementation work is about getting everybody in the same boat, rowing in the same direction to achieve meaningful outcomes for students. So we're going to now transition into this idea of who is qualified to deliver tier 3 support. And I'm going to turn this piece in a sec. Well, I'm going to take this piece and then I'm going to hand it over to Nicole. So we have a reality. Too few people taking up the torch to deliver tier 3. Sometimes we see in schools like a not it type of thing. On one hand, we recognize we have to mobilize these types of supports. On the other hand, we kind of look around wondering who's going to do this then. And so we have a real kind of problem to solve to increase the workforce. We increase the workforce and equip them with quality supports, then more students are going to access what they need. One of the reasons why we see this, this reality is knowledge gaps lead to practice gaps. We're all limited to doing what we know. So if I currently don't know how to do something, it's going to impact my daily practice as an educator. We know if we address knowledge gaps, we can promote improved practices by people. We also know that some people just don't feel that comfortable and confident yet doing it, and emphasize the word yet. So we need to mobilize supports in terms of training, coaching, peer supports, protected time to think deeply, to put in place the new supports, and we can improve comfort levels and confidence levels. I want you to think about kind of the lens through teachers for a second. Now, we know people's beliefs impact their behavior. When it comes on the social, emotional, behavioral side of things, we've done belief surveys. Sometimes educators, based on their background training and their own experiences, they may think that delivering social emotional supports in the classroom aren't their job. It's not my job. And as people who are outside of that lens see it not only as a job, we see it is the plate, building relationships and creating a supportive environment and teaching students social emotional skills to better regulate themselves is the job. We see the same type of phenomenon, though, with people who are well positioned to deliver tier 3 supports. They don't think this work is their job. And it's just like a teacher where we'd want to support them to start to see it as part of the job. We need to work with all of our educational professionals to start to see tier 3 as part of their job. And it's not going to be their full plate, but it is going to be something that they can do and will take up the torch to do. And there's a lot of myths I find around who gets permission to do it. Like there are beliefs out there. I don't get permission to be able to do this type of tier 3 support. And those myths and misinformation mean people withdraw from taking up that torch of tier 3 and increasing student access to those needed supports. So part of the work we're trying to do is address some of these reasons why we see people not taking up the torch. So we get more people to ultimately take up that torch.
So we want to hear from you again, right? So in the chat, what happens if we approach tier 3 and we say that only a single group of educational professionals get permission to do this? So what if I were to say only counselors or only school psychologists or only behavior specialists or BCBAs, right? If I were to name only one group, what is the implication of this? If we say that only one group gets permission to do this tier 3 work and support these students. Yeah, so I see in the chat, absolutely, those professionals, they get burned out. They feel overwhelmed. They feel like all of this intense need is only on their plate and they are solely responsible for taking on that work. Absolutely.
Yeah, tier 3 is not a person. We see that sometimes it's named person in the system, and it's really a system of care.
Yeah, absolutely. Also kind of maximizing like everybody's knowledge and also maximizing like who is responsible for this work, right? That we are all collectively responsible, right? We might have individuals who, take on more specific tier 3 work, but as a system, right? Our whole system is responsible for supporting students with tier 3 needs. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, agree with what's coming in the chat. So there's a couple options for approaching tier 3. One is that we can outsource, right, students' needs to a community-based mental health provider, mental health support. Some students are receiving this through telehealth, like, right, that has become popular since COVID as well. So we can outsource to others. We can also do what is considered like a co-location provider or like a contracted school-based mental health support. That's sort of our second option, is that we can do things within the school setting. Someone is coming from the outside, they're doing it at school. But sometimes what happens with that is there isn't any sort of clarity about what that individual might be doing with the student, and we don't see any sort of collaboration between those people coming into our schools and providing the support and us actually as practitioners in the school. The other option, right, is school-based, right? This is what we're talking about today, is school-based tier 3 support that is delivered by an educational professional within our setting at school. So we have a couple approaches for tier 3. What we know, a reality, is that the workforce really struggles to feel competent and confident in this area of tier 3. In knowing what and how to do this, what do we do to support students? How do we engage in a process to support these students? We know that people do not feel competent and confident in this area. We also know, right, we talked about the need is there, it exists. So we have to increase this workforce, and how might we do this? We know that tier 3 sort of at its core is a process for engaging in high quality data collection and gathering information to get to the root cause of that student's need and then matching them to an intervention. Then being able to implement that intervention and see if we made the right match. So we know that there are people in the schools who have expertise to do that, right? They're trained to do that. They've been trained in behavior supports, that problem-solving process. But we also know that there are people in our setting right now who are capable of developing the ability to deliver tier 3 support, right? They just need the right training and they need the right level of support and coaching for them to also be able to take on this work. So it is not just those like specialists or those single group educators.
Yeah, I'm going to get into this idea of scope of practice. I want to go back and answer a couple of questions. Our tier 3 interventions, Natasha, you mentioned a good one. When do we deliver these supports? Oftentimes, our master schedules can be our biggest obstacle to overcome. So we got to strategically look at our master schedule to figure out where are the pockets of time where we can provide certain types of support, especially if it's like skill supports. where we're working with the student in a personalized, individualized way to acquire skills, apply those skills to be able to overcome challenges and demands for the environment. We have a document we'll share and link outside of this as part of the follow-up resources on how to find that intervention time within your master scheduling, given different options that schools have used. Ideally, what we would do is not take cause students to lose instructional academic, meaningful academic time. So we're carving out time in the day to create space for this type of work. So it's not like an opportunity cost. You're receiving a tier 3 support, but it's at the cost of now not receiving certain academic or other meaningful experiences in schools. Tammy, your question around, do students need to give permission for tier 3? Often we think it's the most effective way to approach this through really strength-based motivational language. In our Character Strong tier 3 solution, we have ways to partner with families using strength-based language, and it's called WISE messaging. The WISE part is like social psychologically language that increases the probability someone feels good about the request or invitation, and it increases the probability of saying yes. So we've designed these, and as a researcher, I've done actual randomized control trials, how you can increase school-home partnership by simply embedding our communications with this WISE messaging to be able to do that. But we often say, yes, we want to involve the family in this process. They are a member of the team. We're doing something with them as part of that. So the question here, Natasha, one more. If students are being captured correctly in tier 3, we should see a decrease in the number of students needing these interventions. Yeah, I mean, ideally, we'd reduce the number of students who need these interventions through quality tier 1 and tier 2 work. That's the science on multi-tiered systems of support. And if we're doing really significant, meaningful tier 3 supports, students respond. And if you follow up, if they respond, that they maintain some of the benefits into the future. Some students may need different types of supports. They kind of fluctuate in and out over time. Think about their educational tenure. They could respond, go back to a lesser support, but based on situational needs in their lives and things happening, they could need tier 3. And that's why we don't want to relegate where we do in a district. We're doing quality tier 3 work in our elementary schools, but then it's non-existent in our middle school or our high schools or some other iteration on that type of outcome. So let's talk scope of practice. This is kind of language around who is permitted to perform a given practice based on the design of the support itself and using ethical standards. Ethical standards are two main principles. One's called non-malfeasance, make sure you're not doing harm, and then beneficence, make sure you're working towards producing beneficial outcomes. Here's the thing. If I don't think something's in my scope of practice, and say I'm a school psychologist, I am a school psychologist, and I say, nope, it's not within my scope of practice, is that more ethical than not serving the kid? So I don't want to serve the kid. So the kid now, there's a potential student who doesn't access a support. So the ethical dilemma is it's within the scope of practice. The way in which the supports have been designed, it's within the scope of practice of many, many educational professionals. Our goal is to then kind of figure out how do we bring it within the scope of competence, which we'll address in a moment. But whose scope of practice can deliver tier 3 supports? These are some of the educational providers, school counselors, school psychs, school social workers, behavior specialists, teachers on special assignment, who maybe have some background training related to it, nurses with certain background training, and then we have these co-located contracted mental health providers. Our goal, though, is to make sure we know the care they're delivering and we know how to support the student to generalize whatever they're learning in those sessions outside of the session in the school environment. And too often our co-located mental health providers are not delivering care or supports that we understand and can support the student to apply outside of that context. And so those are kind of who's within the scope of practice. I want to give some food for thought here. There's been lots of studies dating back to the 1970s to solve workforce issues when it comes to people who have needs. So there's been lots of studies comparing even paraprofessionals against like licensed PhD psychologists. Both groups are supported with good training, coaching, and feedback to improve their clinical practice. And so the findings of this is there's been 42 studies comparing the effectiveness of professional and paraprofessional in delivering care. And it's argued that the findings are consistent and provocative. Paraprofessionals achieve clinical outcomes equal to or significantly better than those obtained by professionals. So the food for thought is, if we're going to really expand our workforce, do we work towards making sure that potentially any fingerprinted person who receives the right training, coaching, follow-up support, feedback is capable of doing this work? The evidence suggests yes. Now, paraprofessionals, the funding sources could come from different places, but we got to be creative. How can we create funding realities and expand our workforce? And educational leaders have to grapple with this. How do we create the realities to have the workforce to meet the needs that students are bringing to the educational table daily and consistently? And Nicole's going to address the second, and in my view, most important part is when it's within someone's scope of practice, we got to bring it within their scope of competence.
Yeah, so let's just define what this scope of competence is. So this is the knowledge and skills which a person can perform well based on access to professional development and continuous improvement, right? So what does that mean? That means that someone can perform these skills and these practices, right, as long as they're provided adequate professional development, learning, right? They're able to gain that knowledge and they get some of that continued coaching and feedback. So how do we do this, right? How do we bring something into someone's scope of competence that they don't yet have, right? So this idea of yet is going to be pretty apparent throughout our whole session today. So we can do this obviously through training, right? Bringing high quality training to those individuals to be able to increase their knowledge. Today we're talking right around tier 3 supports and evidence-based practices. We can also do this through high quality coaching. So being models and coaches for those individuals. So like, for instance, myself as a school psychologist, I might fall under that scope of practice right now, right? This is within my scope of practice, but I can act as a really good coach to help bring up this scope of competence into other individuals, right? We can also do this, we know, with monitoring and feedback, providing people with information about how they're doing, implementing that support and that practice, and giving them high quality feedback on how to improve. Another huge piece of this is making sure that we have that protected time to be able to do this, not only for protected time for learning, for training and coaching, but protected time for those individuals to plan how will they do this? How will they incorporate this into their day? We have to be able to have that protected time to be able to do all of these things to increase that competence. We know that competence and excuse me, confidence are absolutely necessary in order to get this done, right? So we have to increase what educators know and what they have knowledge to be able to do. And we also have to be able to increase their confidence and feeling like they can provide and deliver these tier 3 supports. If we are able to do these two things, we can increase our capacity. So Clay talked earlier about that like base rate and capacity rate, right? That the capacity is really, really important so that we can actually support the amount of students who need tier 3 support. If we lack this competence and confidence, it can lead to a couple things. So sort of the kick the can example is that our qualified staff maybe feel like it's not part of their scope of practice, right? So we like kick the can to somebody else. We can rely on that contracted mental health, right? Or those like co-located individuals. And this can lead to, again, we've mentioned this a couple of times, that fragmented support. And it doesn't always result in school embedded services. That like collaboration between school and those professionals doesn't always happen. Or this is kind of maybe like my favorite. We're going to ask you sort of which one you resonate with. I really resonate with this last one. We overload special education. So we end up overburdening our special education teachers or our service providers, because we're not providing that sort of gen ed level of tier 3 supports. So we want to hear from you, which one of these resonates with you, right? That kick the can example where we're kind of saying like, not it, not my job. We are relying on those contracted mental health professionals that are coming into our schools, but maybe we're not in partnership with them, or our special education is really overloaded right now with the amount of students with intense needs. All right, seeing kick the can, I've seen a sped overload. I can relate. As a school psychologist, that is a very intense reality, that our special education is being so overloaded that what is ending up happening is that the quality and the intensity of services provided in special education actually becomes less sometimes than like tier 2 or tier 3 supports, because there's so many students within special education.
Yeah, I think the all of the above part really
All of the above.
resonates. It's like,
Yeah,
yep. And then
everything.
proportionality pieces that start to when the
Yes.
system is not granting high quality prevention, early intervention supports and stuff, we start to see disproportionate representation in more restrictive settings, in essentially categories that are associated with less favorable educational experiences, not beneficial educational experiences. And that's when it's a point at which everybody out of the water. We have subgroups of students who are getting disproportionate exposure to lackluster experiences in our school. And so we got to figure out what's the source and root cause for that and work towards doing that. I helped co-found, it's called the School Mental Health Assessment Research and Training Center out of the University of Washington, and really grappling with how do we increase school mental health services into our schools. And all three of these issues are frequent, common, and represent things that educators need to work towards overcoming, to make sure that of the qualified people, more people see that this does fit within their scope of practice. And be transparent. I don't feel like it's within my scope of competence, so I'm going to need training, coaching, and feedback and protected time to develop that competence and confidence over time. The contracted stuff, we've done the studies. The effects are really, really low of contracted mental health supports if that mental health provider isn't embedding their supports in the daily routines and working with educators to support students. And then we have bloated special education identification rates when these if things start to happen, which also weakens the quality of special education services for students who actually need that level of care. So let's go through this. How do we kind of move forward and build competence and confidence in the service of increasing capacity? You know, we need really usable interventions. The one way to think about this is really quality, implementable tier 3 supports. But we know just having the supports without the professional development and things that can cultivate us to be able to use them well and develop fluency with using them over time isn't going to work. So we need really good ongoing training, case coaching, that protected time, how to use that time, and then fidelity monitoring and feedback loops. And then we need good data to drive efficient, rapid decisions as we're on this kind of pathway or journey of tier 3 supports for a given student. So let's dig into some of the usable interventions. Just want to share a little bit of information of how we approach it with our character strong tier 3 solution. What we've designed are things that bring everything together into one easy access place so schools can increase their capacity to do really quality tier 3 work. There's personalized support pathways. We have resources to guide educators to put in place environmental supports for students who need it, to scaffold that so they are really quality behavior support plans that change the environment to promote the students' behavioral success in the service of better outcomes for themselves and others. The skill support pathway is helping students who have underlying mental health needs access quality mental health supports that are skill focused, that it's within the purview and scope of practice of all kinds of different educational professionals in our schools who can take up the torch and do this work. Database decision-making tools on how to gather data, use that data to translate it into key decisions along the Tier 3 process. Our solution has a student dashboard that allows educators to at a glance see who's receiving support, what type of support, and how well those supports are working, as well as dig into individual students where they can look at critical information related to that student as it with regard to Tier 3. And then with our solution comes ongoing, never-ending professional development. The investment in it, we didn't want to separate the training, the coaching from the actual supports. It comes with it. It's all integrated into one solution, so people don't have to access it as a separate thing. It has ongoing professional development in the form of live training, case coaching, asynchronous learning modules that are embedded in the system itself. Now, Tier 3, we like to think about it as a team-driven process. It goes back to that formula Nicole mentioned. This is not just a set of interventions. It's not just people. It is actually people coming together on a team in partnership with the student and the family to follow a really coordinated process that everybody is on the same page with. And they're kind of calibrating their behavior. And this is an example of the process we use. When a team gets really efficient as a process, they increase their capacity to serve more students. If we're really clunky at the process, it's wasteful of time and energy, and wasted time and energy means less students are receiving quality care. And so it's really about the adults getting on the same page to come together and follow a quality process that helps them select a really effective intervention, develop a plan to make sure that intervention gets delivered, be able to gather data and have data at their fingertips so they can review that information and make decisions. And so we have a platform that really helps guide educators to go step by step through the process for a student. Also, at a glance, be able to see who's receiving supports, what types of supports, and then guide the team to design the supports themselves. And so we're trying to increase the workforce. Who can be on this team? We have outlines of people who are critical members of this team who have specific roles and responsibilities to come together to design the supports and then ultimately implement them with fidelity to ensure students access the support they need. One of the support pathways is environmental support. I mentioned this early. One of the evidence-based practices at Tier 3 is function-based behavior support plans. What a really quality behavior support plan pulls together are teaching strategies to help equip the student with behaviors to get their needs met in a more socially acceptable way, as well as work towards behaviors that help enable them to be positive co-contributors of their classroom environments and ultimately maximize their engagement in their learning experiences. But there's also prevention strategies. How do we front load with proactive practices that prevent unskillful behaviors and promote more skillful ways of responding when situations come up for the student, as well as responsive practices. After the student behaves, how can we more effectively respond to student behavior with empathy and a teaching approach versus a punitive approach, as well as reinforce and recognize and strengthen alternative behaviors to those unskillful behaviors. So I'll go back here. Our platform guides the team to just do that, really lowering the burden on the team and helps the team gather the functional behavioral assessment data, take that data, translate it into what we call a hypothesis that explains what's currently happening. That hypothesis then is used to generate those teaching strategies, prevention strategies, and responsive practices. And now we're all on the same page and guided in a similar vein. The skill support pathway is for students with underlying mental health needs. And there's different reasons why students struggle, and we adopt a strength-based approach. We don't want to stigmatize students as part of a Tier 3 process. They can't feel like something's broken or wrong in them. What they need to do is know that it's within them to acquire skills and tap into supportive relationships that help them overcome challenging situations. So we have supports we've designed for students who are struggling due to worry, fear, or anxiety, students who are struggling with depression or irritability, students who are struggling due to trauma or outside adversity in their lives, and students who are struggling due to executive functioning needs. And our skill support pathway allows educators to access the resources and information to deliver these skill supports in a way that's aligned with the scientific evidence on the most effective practices we could be doing to support a student to acquire skills. And what you're seeing here is just kind of an example of a session landing page where there's first connection activities so an educator can build rapport for the student. Then there's start section, which helps the student locate where they're at in their learning, go over some ground rules to get the most out of the session. The learn part is where there's educator scripting to really increase educator competence and confidence that they can deliver it, as well as student-facing workbooks. So you can start to see with the right tools and resources, we can bring something that is within someone's scope of practice, within their scope of competence, if we provide them with usable tools and then support them using those tools and resources through ongoing training and case coaching. And that's why for Character Strong Tier 3, that ongoing training and case coaching is pivotal to help people become competent and confident. The last piece here is some of the database decision-making tools that are accessible that allow educators to rapidly gather, summarize data for use. So in the system, there's easy ways for educators to track student response and progress to the in response to the intervention, as well as gather fidelity data on the degree to which the intervention is being delivered as planned. These pieces come together, the usable Tier 3 supports, the database decision-making, and the training that is delivered to help, and case coaching that's designed specifically to help people become competent, to bring this work within their scope of competence. The more competent the adults are at, the higher quality experiences and supports our young people receive as a result of that. So I want to spend a little bit of time. We have 3 minutes left. I'm going to talk about a couple of upcoming events and then protect the rest of the time to answer any questions that people might have. We have some upcoming events. We have a Tier 2 demo if you're really interested in getting that Tier 2 support up and running. And I'm noticing my thumb was up. Jeez, my camera gets up in the most bizarre ways. Tier 2 demo, please join us. We have a middle school and high school curriculum demo. That's our Tier 1 work. We have a webinar next week on how to go from reactive to proactive around Tier 3. We have a Tier 3 demo if you're interested in checking out our Tier 3 demo. And then we have an elementary demo. A couple of other things would love to. We have a national conference in Tacoma, Washington, July 24th and 25th. It's a really cool event with breakout sessions, keynotes from nationally recognized people. We'd really invite you to come join us for that. And then for Tier 1, we have what's called the school culture training. It involves our Tier 1 core practices around the SERVE model. The SERVE model has things like start with a warm welcome and a routine start, which is 4 at the door plus 1 more. It really operationalizes core Tier 1 practices that schools can implement to build those foundational supports of prevention and establish that foundation that enables more intensive supports to work, such as at the Tier 3 level. So I'm going to go through now and see if we have any questions. I saw a couple here around just academic, the stakeholders around who does kind of Tier 3 academic work. In my view, it opens up to even more qualified professionals. We have instructional consultants, we have teachers who can mobilize academic intervention. Academic intervention, for example, in literacy, is precise skill instruction. And what we're trying to do is increase the time, the dosage that the student receives instructional support beyond course support, but that instruction is precisely tailored to the skill that the student has not yet mastered. And it's called assess down the skill hierarchy to teach up it. And we have that in literacy and math, but our workforce can be even more people than what was shown on the screen earlier when we were largely talking about the social, emotional, and behavioral side of things. Nicole, are there any other questions here as we wrap up?
I did see, so that academic as well. Another question was thinking about like the proactive approach of tier 3 versus like the punitive approach that we can tend to take towards behavior, which can sort of really lead to those like inequities and disproportionality. Esther mentioned like the prison, kind of that like school to prison pipeline. So kind of like the purpose of this is, right, that like proactive nature is that we are supporting these students prior to the needs getting so intense, right, that we are either like outsourcing, right, we're pushing them out to other support or services that we know generally isn't as effective, which is really unfortunate, isn't as effective. And also, right, kind of like catching things before they get too intense, which can like reinforce us as adults, right? Where adults are reinforced by, excuse me, sort of reinforced by this can become like someone else's problem, someone else's issue. We unintentionally reinforce ourselves as adults when we don't take this proactive approach. I want to make sure I see a little bit more details of your question about sort of that inequity or disproportionality piece.
Yeah, I shared an article on a study we did to address discipline disparities,
Yeah.
and was largely a method we call Great Stop Prompt. We equipped educators with more effective ways to prevent and then respond to behavior, and the disparities go away. And it's equipping the adults with alternative practices to the punitive discipline. And all of a sudden, we see more equitable responses. We see more effective behavior on the back end and more engagement as a result of that approach. Just going to wrap up, say thank you for joining us. This issue of the like who's qualified, the workforce issue is a really important one to grapple with and identify as a problem to solve. And I know with commitment and motivation, educators can incrementally increase the workforce, equip them with quality supports. And again, students are the beneficiaries of when the adults figure out those pieces. So thank you for tuning in, and we'll hopefully see you at the next webinar or some other event in the future. Take care, everybody.